Hello, my name is Philippe Vesser, and I briefly introduced myself in a previous video called Deficit, which dealt with the problem of controlling public deficits. I invite you to watch that video if you have not done so already, not because you need to know who I am, but because I believe that seeing the deficit video is vital to understand this video. The deficit video establishes a relationship between the public balance and two other macroeconomic indicators. The first is what I call the pure private savings ratio, which reflects what proportion of corporate and household revenue is spent. The second indicator is the external balance of the economy being analyzed. This same relationship is used in this video, called growth, to show how the public deficit is linked to growth. So, is growth always the best way to reduce the public deficit? How does economic activity vary? In the deficit video was shown that public balance ratio equal external balance ratio minus private sector balance ratio, which I called pure private savings ratio. In the deficit video, I explained that the sector's balance is the difference between all the revenue and the expenditure generated by its economic activity, and its balance ratio is the balance other ratio of GDP. I use that relationship to explain how the public balance is formed. We can also use this relationship to reveal the link between growth and changes in the public balance ratio, as I will now explain. The public balance can be expressed using the relationship that I have just explained, but it can also be expressed in simpler terms, as obviously it is equal to public revenue minus public expenditure. Public revenue depends mainly on economic activity, which is measured by GDP, and public revenue can be linked to GDP through the levies ratio. Public revenue equal levies ratio multiplied by GDP. The public balance can therefore be expressed as the public levies ratio multiplied by GDP minus public expenditure. By feeding this equation into the first equation, we obtain a relationship that expresses GDP, as we will see in the next slide. The resulting relationship expresses GDP as total public expenditure divided by a denominator formed by three terms: the public levies ratio, the pure private savings ratio, and the external balance ratio. This relationship shows that GDP and GDP variations are a result of, number one, fiscal policy as reflected by public expenditure and the public levies ratio. Number two, how corporations and households spend their revenue as measured by the pure private savings ratio. And number three, the economy's external competitiveness as reflected by the external balance ratio. The value in establishing this relationship between GDP and these four factors is that doing so reveals the precise effect that simultaneous changes to those factors have on GDP. If we know those four factors, we can calculate GDP to the nearest euro. This relationship is not the result of a statistical regression, but of a logical construction, an analysis model and the relationship always holds true. Many other analysis models could be constructed. Their relevance would depend on the relationships on which they are based. The model's relevance lies in the fact that A. It expresses public expenditure as being independent from GDP changes. B. It establishes a connection between public revenue and GDP via the public levies ratio. And C. The assertion, as explained in the deficit video, that the private sector controls its balance and that this balance, combined with the external balance, determines the public balance. Using this relationship, we can look at the link between growth and the variation in the public balance ratio. It all depends on the source of that growth, which can be one of four sources. The first two sources are the non-public balance ratios. One of the non-public balance ratios is the external balance ratio. When it goes up, the denominator in the equation becomes smaller, resulting in positive GDP growth. However, as seen in the deficit video, when the external balance ratio increases, so does the public balance ratio. Growth driven by the external balance ratio is therefore accompanied by an increase in the public balance ratio. The other non-public balance ratio that drives growth is the pure private savings ratio, only this time in the opposite direction. It is a fall in pure private savings that results in a smaller denominator, leading to a positive GDP growth. As we saw in the deficit video, a falling pure private savings ratio also makes the public balance ratio go up. Common sense tells us that when corporations and households spend more of their revenue, leading to a reduction in the pure private savings ratio, or when exports increase as a proportion of imports, which means there is a higher external balance ratio, growth will be positive, resulting in a wider fiscal base and therefore a higher public balance ratio. Common sense alone, however, does not allow us to obtain precise calculations of variations in GDP and in the public balance ratio, which come from variations in the external balance ratio or variations in the pure private savings ratio, as the other parts of the relationship remain constant. But the relationships that I've just outlined do allow us to make those precise calculations. Growth is not necessarily a result of changes in the two non-public balance ratios. It can also be a result of fiscal policy, i.e., changes in spending or the public levies ratios. Increased public spending obviously has an expansionary effect. But is it accompanied by a higher public balance ratio? Well, if the pure private savings ratio and external balance ratio do not change, we know, as explained in the deficit video, that the public balance ratio will not change either. Similarly, a drop in the public levies ratio also has an expansionary effect. But if the pure private savings ratio and external balance ratio do not change, we also know, as explained in the deficit video, that the public balance ratio will not change either. We've just assumed that when one of the two components of fiscal policy vary, the external balance ratio remains the same. But what if the external balance ratio did vary? We saw in the deficit video that marginal rise in public spending normally reduces the external balance ratio because imports increase while exports remain unchanged. But this is for a marginal expenditure. In other words, an additional expenditure on top of the existing public spending. But what about the effect that this existing public spending has on the economy's public balance ratio? Well, if the economy's external competitiveness, pure private savings ratio, and public levies remain constant, it all depends on the contribution that public spending makes to economic growth. If an economy's growth is weaker than that of its trading partners, then, because external competitiveness is assumed to be constant, export will perform better than import, so the external balance ratio will improve, and in turn so will the public balance ratio. If an economy's growth is stronger than that of its trading partner, the opposite will happen. Based on the assumption I've just mentioned, the public balance ratio will deteriorate. Although I'm talking about growth fueled by public spending, the same would be true if the growth were fueled by a drop in the public levies ratio. Under the assumptions I've just mentioned, everything depends on the economy's growth compared with growth in its trading partners' economies. What are the limits of a tight fiscal policy? If external competitiveness remains constant, a tight fiscal policy that reduces public spending or increases the public levies ratio will improve an economy's public balance ratio by generating lower economic growth than in the trading partner economies. But if the country does not improve its external competitiveness, it cannot recover lost growth without undoing the improvements to its external balance ratio, which would result in a lower public balance ratio. Improving the external competitiveness is the only way to make up for lost ground without undoing the improvement to the public balance ratio. But improving the external competitiveness takes time. The resulting recovery in the external balance, however, not only restores the public balance, but also contributes to growth. If the government takes too long to adopt a policy aimed at improving the economy's external competitiveness to reduce the excessive public deficit, it risks experiences a debt crisis, thus forcing it to urgently adopt an extremely stringent policy that will restore its public balance, but only by sparking a recession that will improve the external balance ratio by reducing imports. We must not draw wrong conclusions from what I've just said. I'm not saying, for instance, that curbing public spending should be avoided if the public deficit is too big. Poor external competitiveness may well be due to public overspending, and reducing public spending may well be one of the factors that can improve the economy's external competitiveness. We have seen how the relationship that I drew up shows a link between growth and changes in the public balance. But more broadly, this relationship can be used to analyze growth in a certain period based on changes to the four terms shown in the relationship. Take for instance the change in GDP between the year T and the year T plus I. In year T, GDP depends on the year T values of the four terms that can be used to calculate GDP. In year T plus I, GDP depends on the year T plus I values of those terms. Let's now suppose that all the terms have their T plus I values except for one, the public levies ratio, which remains at the same value it had in year T. From this, we can obtain a theoretical GDP. The changes in the levies ratio from its value in year T to its value in year T plus I causes GDP to change from the theoretical value I just mentioned to its year T plus I value. The difference between the value of GDP in year T plus I and its theoretical value is therefore the approximate contribution of the levies ratio to GDP growth between year T and year T plus I. We could apply the same procedure to the three other terms of the equations. This method allows us to break down the total change in GDP by considering it equal to the sum of the approximate contributions generated by each of the terms. The result, of course, is also an approximation and is more accurate when the terms have changed little. Thanks to this analysis method, we can see the link between growth and changes in the public deficit. Let's look at two 3-year post-recession periods in France, the first from 1976 to 1978, following the 1975 recession, and the second from 1994 to 1996, following the 1993 recession. In the first period, growth was strong, averaging 4% a year, or 12% for the whole period. In the second period, it was moderate, at 2% per year, or 6% for the whole period. Fiscal policy was the driving force behind the first period of growth, contributing around 10%, thanks to a 15% increase in public spending, the effect of which on growth was a little bit impacted by a 2% rise in the public levies ratio that had a negative effect on growth. Nevertheless, as we saw earlier, growth driven by fiscal policy does not affect the public balance ratio directly, but it can affect it indirectly if the economy's growth is stronger than that of its trading partners, thus dampening the external balance. That's not what happened, however. Instead, world growth, which is assumed to reflect growth in partner economies, fared slightly better than French growth. So, France's external balance ratio stagnated and was unable to influence the public balance or growth. Only the 1% drop in the pure private savings ratio was responsible for the timid 1% rise in the public balance ratio and also drove GDP up 3%. In total, during this period of strong growth, the public balance ratio improved only slightly, for the reason I've just explained. In the 3 years following the 1993 recession, growth was only half as strong as it was during the first period. Yet, unlike during the first period, growth during the second period was not driven by a fiscal stimulus. Although public expenditure was up 5%, the stimulus it provided was cancelled out almost entirely by additional public levies of around 2% of GDP that had a negative effect on growth. The external balance ratio edged up only slightly, so it had little impact on growth over the 3 years. Instead, the 2% decline in the pure private savings ratio was the source for most of the growth over the period, as well as for the 2% improvement in the public balance ratio. Growth during the second period was half the level of growth during the first period, even though the public balance ratio improved by twice as much. This example shows clearly that the impact of growth on the public deficit depends on the source of that growth. Another advantage of my model is that it reveals the role of fiscal policy in determining very long-term growth. Pure private savings fluctuate in the short term, and these fluctuations have a strong influence on short-term fluctuations in GDP. But over a very long period, if there are only very small changes in the pure private savings ratio and the external balance ratio between the start and the end of the period, growth during that period is driven mainly by fiscal policy. That's what happened in the USA and in France during the 30 years between 1985 and 2014. US GDP grew by 120% and French GDP by 72% during that period. Yet, the pure private savings ratios and external balance ratios of both countries were more or less the same at the start and end, so the variations made a negligible contribution to growth. Fiscal policy, therefore, drove most of the growth during those 30 years. Surprising as it may seem, US growth was stronger than French growth, mainly because US public expenditure outgrew French public expenditure, plus 127% versus plus 93%. Since in both countries most of the growth was driven by the additional public expenditure. Note, by the way, that public levies in the USA increased slightly less than in France, which goes some way to explaining why growth was stronger in the US, and the increase in public levies there had a smaller negative impact on growth. You might argue that it's the relationships behind the model that make public expenditure the source of growth. The model is such that private sector expenditure is linked to private sector revenue via the pure private savings ratio, whereas the same is not true for public sector expenditures and revenue. But I believe this approach is relevant and reflects economic realities. In their annual budgets, although governments cannot just spend however they like, they do set their spending levels independently from their revenues. Households, on the other hand, generally spend based on their income, and corporations, which must manage their debts, do the same. Again, don't misinterpret what I've just said. I'm definitely not saying that public expenditure is the only driver of growth. Fiscal policy can also stimulate growth by lowering public levies. Moreover, fiscal policy stimuli only affect the demand side. But if supply cannot meet demand, imports will grow more quickly than exports, dragging down the external balance ratio and with it the public balance ratio. Eventually, growth will reach its limit, which is determined by the amount of public debt that the economy can support. I will be controversial by saying that using fiscal policy to stimulate demand is an easy solution with immediate effects. Stimulating the supply side, however, is a different story. In fact, it's not so much the responsibility of government as it is of entrepreneurs and their staff. What government can do, however, is build a legal, social and cultural environment that fosters supply-side growth. Doing so is much more difficult than using a fiscal stimulus, and the effects are slower, but it is essential in order to cut the excessive public deficit, because improving the quality of an economy's supplies means increasing its external competitiveness, and therefore also its external balance, which is the key to any healthy improvement in the public balance ratio. Over the years, the world's economies have become more and more intertwined. This has one drawback. It has amplified external deficits caused by competitive disadvantages, and in doing so, it has amplified public deficits. Consequently, public debt has skyrocketed in many countries, including the USA, France, and Italy, not to mention Japan, where it has reached exorbitant levels. Public debt cannot go on increasing indefinitely. There must come a time when the financial market's astounding torrents will end, triggering a massive crisis. Nevertheless, in this case, tight fiscal policy would not be the best solution to excessive public debt. A tight fiscal policy only works if a country's growth is lower than that of its partner countries. If several large countries all adopt this kind of policy simultaneously, it will harm growth in their partner countries. It is in nobody's interest for world growth to slow down, and such a slowdown would do nothing to bring excessive public debt under control. What can reduce the public deficit is not the rate of growth per se, but the difference between a country's rate of growth and that of its partner countries. That is why tight fiscal policies are useless if they are adopted on a large scale. It would be better for countries to agree to maintain a certain level of growth. Now, you might argue that dealing with the public deficit by stimulating demand contradicts what I said earlier. But stimulating demand in just one country is not the same as stimulating demand everywhere simultaneously. And this kind of stimulation, like what is agreed upon during recessions, would not be easy to implement. It would require surplus countries to apply greater stimuli than deficit countries. But that is the cost of maintaining world growth while reducing excessive public deficits. Returning to the idea I've already discussed, Is it a pipe dream to imagine international cooperation going one step further by tackling the problem of imbalanced foreign trade? Doing so is even more complex than coordinating fiscal policies, not least because it involves the issue of exchange rates, in addition to that of excessive pure private savings. We can draw 5 main conclusions from what I've said. The first is that an economy's GDP and changes to its GDP can be calculated to the nearest euro from 4 components. Number 1, the proportion that the private sector spends of its revenue as measured by the pure private savings ratio. Number 2, the trade balance as measured by the external balance ratio. Number 3, the amount of public expenditure. And number 4, the public levies ratio. The second conclusion is that the impact of growth on the public deficit depends on the source of that growth. Changes in the 2 non-public balance ratios, for instance, directly affect both growth and the public balance ratio. Fiscal policy also affects growth directly, but it affects the public balance ratio only indirectly, via the external balance ratio. The third conclusion is that a stringent policy affects an economy's public balance ratio by making growth lower than in partner economies, which raises the external balance ratio. The fourth conclusion is that to reduce a fiscal deficit without harming growth too much, a supply-side policy must be pursued to improve external competitiveness. The final conclusion is that international cooperation is needed to reduce excessive public debts without putting too much downward pressure on world growth. At the very least, this requires coordination of fiscal policy, and ideally, there should be coordinated action to drive down external deficits that are too high. For a more in-depth analysis, read Reducing the Public Deficit, which is available as a hard copy on Amazon. The book goes into more detail, looking at several case studies with data presented in the form of tables and graphs. Also, take a look at the website deficitandgrowth.com, which includes data regarding the countries for which the OECD provides the information that my analysis method requires. On the site, you can consult the data in the form used by my method, and you can work with the data using simulation tools. Finally, a first YouTube video called Deficit deals with the problem of controlling public deficits. A third video, entitled Accounting Observation, deals with more technical matters, in particular the relationship between investments and savings in traditional economic analysis, which is different from the concept of pure savings that I have developed. All of these publications are also available in French. Thank you for your time. Please feel free to send any comments to deficitandgrowth@gmail.com.